bubble blowing friends, and welcome back to another video. Today we are going to do something a little different. So I've been sick this past week, which means we haven't actually been able to do our pre-planned camping trip, which involves hopefully a lot of spearing, a lot of snorkeling, and meeting a lot of shark friends. But I thought, in my fever dream state, that it would be fun to do a tier list on sharks, because what else am I gonna do when I'm sick and having my fever dreams? But I wanted to do something slightly different, because if I was gonna make a tier list on sharks, all of them are gonna be S tier, because they're all amazing in my books. So, except for, where is it? This Lovecraftian horror. So I'm going to make a tier list based on the likelihood that the sharks are going to make it another 100, 200, 300 years in the future, based on their own evolutionary traits that help them in their environment, human impact factors and biases, and anything else, like potentially like where they live and how likely it is that that is going to become like a threat to them. The point of this tier list is to have a look at how these sharks are adapted and how well they can be adapted for the current changing climate. So a little bit different, but I thought it'd be a little bit of fun. So the first one we have here is a wobbegong shark. So wobbegong sharks are carpet sharks. They sit at the bottom and they don't really do much. They sit and wait to ambush predators. That means that they are already pretty suited to the environment that they're in, as long as their environment stays protected and safe, that they're very likely able to continue. They eat anything that comes too close to their nose, like an anglerfish without the angle. So their main threats are probably going to be things like fishing, potentially if they get caught up in fishing nets or anything like that. But given that their habitats are often under rocky reefs and stuff, I think they've got a pretty good chance of surviving the human impact side of things. And, you know, divers kind of like to see them. They sometimes like to sit in wrecks or under rocks or in reefs. And as long as their food and habitat stay plentiful, they'll be good. So I'll put them in B tier, because there are a couple of unknowns there. Like, if their habitat stays the same, it'll be good. Next one is the lemon shark. So some of the sharks in this tier list I'm not going to know as much about, and the lemon shark is actually one of them. So I know that they're a very popular shark to dive with, and they can sort of learn how to integrate well with divers. So there can be baited feeds, and the lemon sharks will actually come up to divers and be very inquisitive and in a non-dangerous way, but this really depends on the individual animal. Some animals are very shy, some animals are very confident, some animals are overconfident. So it really depends on the specific animals and what they learn and to associate humans with. Feeding any animal, I think, is a dangerous thing, including sharks. Provision dives where they actually don't feed the sharks is also up for question. But from what I've seen, these sharks are actually quite well behaved in those scenarios. They're a well-loved shark, but also they're a well-hated shark. These are a larger shark, and especially in like the Florida region, they are targeted by fishermen, because fishermen do get frustrated with tigers, bulls, and lemon sharks, where they actually take their fish off their line as they're trying to pull them in. So it's a place of frustration, but also a place of love. So I think they're a very like split feeling shark, if that makes sense. So some people love them, some people hate them. As long as they're protected, I think they'll be okay. But if they're not, then they're in danger. So for that, again, I'll put them in B tier. Next one here is the basking shark. So basking sharks live in sort of the more northern regions around Europe. They aren't a particularly popular shark to dive with at the moment, but there are stirrings of tourism being associated with them in Scotland and Ireland, where the chance to swim with one of these is amazing. They're a non-dangerous shark, which means that people shouldn't be afraid of them. And, well, people shouldn't be afraid of any sharks, but these are a filter-feeding shark. They eat plankton, so as long as the plankton resources are bountiful in the areas they live in, they'll do well. So I think basking sharks are relatively safe. So I'm going to put the basking shark in A tier. Now here's a strange one. Another one I don't actually know terribly much about, and it's the rough angular shark. So I know that sometimes they can be caught by recreational fishermen, and they get thrown back because they don't really have, as far as I'm aware, anything that's really good to eat on them. I just think they're an accidental catch. They seem to be pretty good in their environment. I believe they do live in cooler regions, so I'm going to say I don't really know too much about them, but seeing as they're doing well, and I think their biggest threat, again, like the wobbegong, is if their environment and what they eat is impacted, then they might be more at risk, and also they are caught up as accidental fishing, as far as I'm aware. So put them in C tier, or maybe the end of B tier, I reckon, mostly because I don't really know too much about them, and they seem to be all right. They're doing okay. The next is one of my favorite sharks, is the tiger shark. So tiger sharks are one of the most environmentally adaptable shark, I reckon. They'll eat anything. They're known as the garbage cans of the ocean. They'll eat anything, and they're a very inquisitive and curious shark. They're always looking at what could potentially be food. So there's been things where these sharks have had number plates found in their stomach, tires. They are more scavenger based, but they're also hunters, but they'll be very opportunistic. So being opportunistic in nature and adaptable in nature is always a really good trait to have. They are one of the sharks, unfortunately, that are known to kill people, which puts them on sort of the negative influence side of sharks. In part, I think it is greatly misunderstood. Their actual threat in the water is very minimal. Lots and lots of people dive with them, lots and lots of people provision dive with them, and there have been very few incidents even in like a high, I would say a provision dive with a tiger shark is a high risk environment compared to just swimming on a reef and seeing a tiger shark, because the tiger shark is now trying to figure out what's food and what's not, because they're smelling food and they're wondering if you're food. However, with the low incident rates, tiger sharks are actually quite well behaved as well when it comes to their negative interactions with people. However, there are incidents known to happen between tiger sharks and people. So, as I think the similar thing with the lemon shark, as long as they are protected, their population has dropped quite significantly in the last 50 to 100 years already. It is really sad to see. However, we are noticing it more now. In Australia, we unfortunately have conducted shark culling programs in the past, which have devastated populations of tiger sharks to the point where a genetically unique grouping population of tiger shark has actually gone extinct. Not any species or subspecies of tiger shark, just a unique population has gone extinct, which is tragic because the less genetic diversity within a species, the higher the risk of extinction, which sucks. So I'm still going to put the tiger shark in A tier, despite the negatives that they've already seen, because I believe that people's perceptions of them are changing. I do think that people are seeing tiger sharks in a better light with more education and more interaction in a positive way. And people are sort of getting made aware that the sharks are at risk and at danger, and they are quite an endearing and pretty shark. So I think it's one of the animals that, because they are prettier and bigger and more exciting, that they are going to have more conservation efforts put towards them. So I'm going to put them in A tier for that. And also, just being super adaptive in nature allows them to combat things like climate change. They'll be able to move, migrate, and they're not limited to a specific environment, which is a massive benefit for the sharks. Now, the next shark on the list is the bull shark. So the bull shark has a very bad reputation. It's probably one of the sharks that you hear is probably like the most aggressive or dangerous shark out there in the ocean, which again, I think this is based on the individual and the environment that they're in. So bull sharks are one of the only sharks, or one of the only animals really. Oh no, that's not true. Bull sharks are one of the only sharks that can actually go into freshwater, which is actually really cool. The way, and what makes this special is that when an animal goes from freshwater to saltwater, the freshwater in their cells will diffuse and osmose. If you know much about osmosis, they essentially, what happens is the cell, if it's a saltwater fish coming into freshwater, the freshwater will want to go into the cells of the saltwater fish through diffusion and osmosis, and this will pretty much flood the cells of freshwater and cause them to burst. And then the other thing kind of happens when freshwater fish go into saltwater is that their cells get filled with salt, and it causes like hypersalination, that's a word. It causes the animal to go into shock and die because it's got too much salt in its system, like hypertension. So a bull shark can actually combat this by going in and out of fresh and salt water. I don't actually know how they do it, I just know that they can, and it's a really unique trait, but also makes them a bit more of an intimidating shark, because as a South African, I know this shark as a Zambezi shark because it goes through the Zambezi River, and they're hunting in those rivers, and I guess when you're in a river, you're not really expecting to see sharks or anything too dangerous, maybe crocs, depending on where you are. And then suddenly, you know, you get eaten and you're like, oh, well, that's unfortunate. The shark's not meant to be here. So they do sort of have a higher human-animal conflict rate than I think other sharks, because they can go closer to people than other sharks. I think as well the visibility of the water plays a huge role in a shark's behavior. A shark is much more relaxed and calm and sort of not in hunting mode when they're in clear water. However, if the water is murky, a shark's going to be a lot more opportunistic and try to be in more hunting mode and predate on whatever is in the water, whether it's a person or an antelope or a dog, versus if it's out in the clear ocean. It's also a factor that if you are swimming in murky water, that the sharks might have different behaviors than if the water is clear and you can see the shark and the shark's like, oh, well, they can see me already, let's go investigate. So a bull shark has a negative reputation, but it also, I hear a lot of stories from divers where they've had very positive interactions with sharks, and there are also provision dives with bull sharks as well. In my personal experience, I've noticed that bull sharks have been very shy. I've only seen bull sharks in the distance, swimming away from me. They don't want anything to do with me. The ones in clear water that I've seen have been very shy. I've had people swimming in the Yongala, which is a wreck dive, and bull sharks are sort of known to go there and they'll swim over the divers, and it's intimidating because it's a bull shark and I do have a very negative reputation. However, they are very relaxed in the water. So I think it depends on the animal and the visibility situation with a bull shark. And sometimes they're just like, they don't like you, and then that's it. Got to protect yourself the way you can or get out the water. So still very unlikely to be attacked by a bull shark, because they just the chances of getting attacked by a shark are just slim in general. Even if you are in a river, though, I wouldn't suggest swimming in a river with like predators in. I don't know, that's just kind of bad juju for me. But if you can see the shark, then it'll be good. So for that, they do have an amazing adaptation. However, I am a little bit more unsure, because they do have that bad reputation. If there were like any pushes for culls or anything, I do think the bull shark will be one of the first on the lists. So I'm going to put them in the C tier for that, because a big part of an animal's longevity these days is how much do people like them, how much do people care about them, how much money are we willing to put into their conservation. So whilst they are quite adaptable, being able to go into freshwater and saltwater, their perceived nature, no matter how right or wrong it is really going to dictate their future. So for that, they're going to C tier. Now, again, another one of my favorite sharks is the thresher shark. So thresher sharks are more pelagic fish, so they don't like to hang around reefs. They prefer more open water, and they prefer deep water. So you won't have too many human-shark interactions there. However, it's not uncommon for them to be fished up by recreational fishermen or commercial. So because of their long tail fin, they are a target for shark fin soup, and that is quite unfortunate for them in itself, because they are one of the target species for shark fin soup, which is a relatively unregulated practice, especially along Indonesia and Southeast Asia, which is where a lot of these sharks reside. Their saving factor is that they do have that sense to stay deeper, so it's harder for us to actually get a hold of them. They're mostly a shark that's more nocturnal or in the mornings and evenings rather than a diurnal shark. So that's also another factor towards them. Their main strength in their evolutionary trait is their tail. They have quite a fascinating hunting strategy where they'll just whip into a school of fish instead of targeting individual ones. And because their tail is such like a long weapon, they can stun a bunch of fish and just pick at them. So it's quite a good evolutionary trait, and it is a very pretty shark, and a shark that a lot of divers do like to see. So in the places where they do have thresher shark tourism, like in Thailand, it is in their best interest to protect their sharks, because there is money going towards these places to protect these sharks. So I'm still going to put it into C tier, because they do have that unfortunate sense that like they are a targeted shark for shark fishing and shark finning because of their long tail. You know, that's a lot of bang for your buck. And a lot of boats that you see get confiscated or pulled over for having shark fins in them. You see a lot of threshers in them, so they are a targeted species. And it will be quite something to see if they make it for the next 200, 300 years. I hope they do, but the odds are not stacked with them. Next is something called a zebra shark. So the zebra shark is sort of a more bottom-dwelling shark. And they're a very popular shark to see in the tourism industry. And I call them leopard shark, they're zebra sharks. They just look like leopard sharks because they're spotty, but when they're babies, they're stripy. Confusing, right? I know, it's wild. They eat crabs and crustaceans and mollusks in the bottom of the seafloor, so they're not going to really be swimming to hook onto fishing rods or anything. I haven't really heard much about them. Being caught on fishing rods doesn't mean that they don't. I just haven't heard much about it. They're a popular diving shark. I don't think there's too much to worry about these guys. And because there's the actual leopard shark here, I don't know too much about them. I know they live in cooler regions. They live in kelp forests, live off small fish, octopus. Um, I think their like main predator would be larger sharks. I think they do also live in regions that have great whites in, so they are sort of oppressed by that way, but they're so small. And I think they're quite adaptive to their environment. As long as their environment is safe, I think they'll be safe. So I'm going to chuck them next to Wobbegong for that reason. And another one I don't know too much about, it's a salmon shark. Salmon sharks are often confused as baby great whites because they do kind of look like great whites, but they aren't. But they've got that typical torpedo with fins and teeth. You can't go too wrong with that. I'm just going to put them in B tier because I don't know too much about them. And then here we've got white-tip reef sharks. So white-tip reef sharks are scavengers. They like to hang out on reefs, hence their name. Very opportunistic. So we've had quite a few interactions with white-tip reef sharks when we've been spearing or fishing. They're the ones that are going to take your fish. So you got to be super quick in reeling them in. I think they're fast breeders. They seem to be a fairly common shark on the Great Barrier Reef. However, due to their opportunistic nature, they are quite easy to fish out. There was a couple of shark finning boats that went past one of the islands off of Timor-Leste, and that boat just took out every shark. That includes your white tips, your black tips, your grey reef sharks. There's nothing there anymore. And I don't think it was too hard for them because these are scavengers, so if there's something that they can catch, they will. So I'll put them in C tier because as long as they're protected, they'll be okay. But if they're not at any point, then they're gone. Next one is, it looks like, I think this is just a grey reef shark. Yes, this is just a grey reef shark. I'm sort of going to clump this in with similar behaving sharks like Caribbean reef sharks and black tip reef sharks and silkies. Very similar behaviors. They're good at what they do. They're sort of scavengy, hunty. They are very similar to white tips in their vulnerability, but they are a little bit more, I don't know how else to describe it, like predatory than white tips. And a little bit smarter than white tips. White tips are kind of dumb, I've noticed. They'll swim right up to you and go like, oh, what do I do now? And then swim away, which like leads to some awesome footage and awesome shots. But they are kind of dumb. They kind of do think that they are like the big fish in a little pond kind of vibe. So I'm just going to put them maybe above threshers. And then there's the whale shark. So whale sharks, very similar to basking sharks. Filter feeders. Whale sharks are the largest species of sharks and one of the most loved sharks in the world. Pretty much, if you're a diver, this is the animal you want to see. Whale sharks. They are magnificent, they're beautiful, and they are gentle giants. There's a lot of tourism around whale sharks, a lot of tourism money throughout Australia, Southeast Asia, and anywhere you get whale sharks, the Red Sea, they are much loved. And they're relatively common at the moment. So I'm going to put them next to basking sharks because they are very similar in nature. However, they are more, I guess, loved and more well known than basking sharks. There is a slight threat with fishing and getting hit by boats that they are often caught as bycatch. They are surface-dwelling sharks, so they can get hit by boats, and they can be a target for shark fin soup because their fins are relatively unique with the spots on. So I think I'll still put it in A tier because I think there's a strong love for these sharks. So there's going to be a lot of people pushing for their conservation if anything drastic happens to them. Next is the hammerhead. Again, one of my favorites. So these sharks are really, really interesting. They're there are a whole range of species of hammerheads. Like there's a few different species of wobbegongs, and there's a few different species of, actually no, it's just wobbegongs. So I'm just talking about hammerheads in general, but hammerheads can really range in size diversity and even diet. So there is quite a small hammerhead, I think only about yay big, that is called a bonnethead hammerhead, that is known to actually have a partial diet of like seagrass. And it's not accidental, it is just a partial diet of seagrass. That makes them quite unique, but then there's also larger hammerheads which can be over 2 meters long, called the greater hammerhead. You've got the scalloped hammerheads. I think you've got the winghead, or the winged hammerhead. Is that even a hammerhead? It's a hammerhead-like shark. So their hammerhead, from species to species, changes in shape. I forgot what the thing was called. It was called like hammerhead cephalofoil. Yes. So the hammerhead cephalofoil, so that's what their head is called, and it's filled with electrosensitive senses that can sense heartbeats and any other like electrical signals that animals under the sand might be giving off. Their main diet is based off stingrays that are in the sand, so they'll be sensing along, and then they'll find a ray hidden in the sand and they'll go munch, munch, munch. And so that's how they sense their way through their environment. But also, their eyes being in the position that they are on their head, they can actually have 360-degree vision all around them. So they have a very good idea of what's going on in their environment. They are superbly designed for their environment. They are superbly evolved for it. Like, they are one of the most intriguing and interesting sharks. But they have one downside. They get espressoed. So if a hammerhead undergoes too much stress, it'll release a chemical in their body that will shock their system and kill them. A lot of juvenile hammerheads, even adult hammerheads, will be caught by a line and even transported to aquariums. Now that has quite a high mortality rate for the hammerhead, because if they get too stressed, then they will die before getting to the aquarium itself. So that is a really negative thing for them, and unfortunately, being such an amazingly unique shark that is growing ever more popular, this is going to be an increasing problem for the sharks. So they also get really stressed in nets, so if they get caught as bycatch, they're unlikely to survive. And then, of course, in Australia, #Queensland, we do have shark nets, which catch sharks, and hammerheads will essentially get caught up in the nets, barrel roll, and almost die immediately. Whilst if like a tiger shark or a wobbegong gets caught in the nets, they can kind of sit there being uncomfortable, but if they get found in time, then they're likely to be rescued and saved, whilst a hammerhead will just spin and die within minutes. So they do have a high stress hormone, which I can kind of relate to at times, but unfortunately, despite being such an amazing animal, that negative interaction that they have with humans could lead to their extinction. So again, I'm going to put it in C tier. Here is a type of horn shark called a Port Jackson shark. They are very sweet, and they have very few predators, mostly because they have this little, I'm not sure if you can see it, this little horn here, which means that if anything bites them, it's going to bob into the biter's mouth, hurt the biter, and then the biter, whether it's like a wobbegong shark or something else, will spit this Port Jackson shark out. They are a shark that eats crustaceans, crabs, bottom-dwelling things. So for their environment, they're very well adapted. They're not going to see too many issues from threats around them. However, They are quite easy to catch, and I have seen quite a few fishermen get frustrated with the Port Jackson shark because they do go into the crab nets and take their bait, which means that when people do catch Port Jacksons in some areas, they will just kill them. They get tired of them. I've seen horrible things under jetties in South Australia where people just fin them and throw them back because, like, let's be edgy and cool. And fin sharks because that's what the bad people do. I don't know. So that has been an issue, and we have noticed a change in behaviours since that's really become a problem in South Australia, that the Port Jackson sharks really do shy away from the fisherman's range, which is often off a jetty. They do come together seasonally to breed, and they do need a specific habitat to breed, which is often rocky outcrops, because they do put their eggs in crevices. They have like corkscrew eggs they'll like put into little crevices and keep them safe from other predators, and they do sort of come together, congregate to breed, lay their eggs, move on. And then the babies, little shark puppies, they're so cute. They'll come out and they'll sort of live in the area, move on, and then when the time comes, they'll all come back, same time every year, to breed en masse. And so they're highly dependent on their environment as well. Like the wobbegong, they do need these specific rocky outcrops. However, I do think that, actually they're probably about the same as the wobbegong, really. Except maybe a little bit worse because they are, unfortunately, a target for fishing. So I'll put them behind wobbegongs in B tier. Now the next one is the oceanic whitetip. Again, a shark I deeply respect, and I think is going to be one of the sharks that is almost guaranteed to not survive the next 200 years. In 1969, there were people saying that this shark has the most abundance in any animal on Earth, over 100 pounds, like 45 kilograms. They used to school en masse. They used to be the shark that would eat you if you got thrown off the boat. You know, you walked the plank, you got eaten by the shark. These are the sharks that found you. These are the ones that schooled in the hundreds. They used to be in schools of 200 plus. Nowadays, you'll be lucky to see one ever. There's some places you can go to see them, like in the Red Sea, but their populations have diminished just enormously. This is due to their behavior, which is not doing them any favors. So they're a hugely opportunistic shark, almost aggressively so. They are known as one of the more dangerous sharks to dive with. They are called more aggressive than other sharks because they will sort of test boundaries and see if they can bite and can get a hold of a leg or something. They are the ones that did have the reputation to eat sailors when they got knocked off the boats. They are a very opportunistic predator. However, they are also quite easy to fish up, and so they have pretty much lost all their population already. They're considered to be critically endangered, and the way that things are going, if the shark finning industry is still going on the way it is, these sharks are just easy pickings. So I don't think the oceanic whitetip will make it the next 200 years unless we seriously change the way that we manage our oceans, and unless we seriously change the way that we perceive sharks. Because these are like, the second it goes out that these are like more aggressive than a bull shark, people aren't going to want them in our oceans anyway, which is quite unfortunate because they are such a beautiful shark. You just have to be on your toes if you're in the water with one. They are incredible, beautiful animals, but they are just very vulnerable to gill nets, longline fishing, and very vulnerable to the shark finning industry. So sadly, this is one of the only sharks that will end up in D tier. And then we've got the epaulet shark. Again, I think like all these sharks are my favorite sharks. Why am I saying they're all my favorite? So the epaulet shark is an amazingly adapted animal. This is one of the few animals that can actually leave the water. So an epaulet can crawl over reefs and go from receding tide pool to receding tide pool to catch all the fish that got caught in the tide pools as the tide went out. And they can stay out of water for quite some time. They are also like a very elusive shark, so they are quite hard to find unless you are quite lucky. I don't think they're uncommon. I've seen a few. They're more nocturnal than diurnal, so they'll be around at night a lot more. I feel like they're probably more on the intelligence side of things, but as long as their human-shark interaction doesn't get too high, I think they'll be quite well adapted. So I haven't put anything in S tier yet, but I think the epaulet is one of the ones that is just so superbly adapted for its environment and doesn't have like any large human-shark interactions that would negatively impact it. In fact, the more people hear about this, like the more in awe they are of like such a cool and adapted animal. So I'm going to give that one an S tier. Now we're going into the deep sea sharks. So this here is a frilled shark, and they are kind of odd. We don't know much about the deep sea sharks, so I'll sort of keep these ones brief. Unless there are deep nets or anything like that, I think the frilled shark, very likely to survive the next 200 years. They've been surviving in the deeps for who knows how long. I think they'll be all right. Same with the goblin shark, except that people like goblin sharks more because they've got this jaw that can unhinge and go forward. It's creepy, but also really cool. People know about them more. So if anything were to happen, I think people would jump to arms faster than the frilled shark. So we'll keep those two deep sea sharks in S tier. Now this one here has a couple of names. I know it as a ragged-toothed shark, but it's also known as a grey nurse shark or a sand tiger shark. They are already critically endangered. There are a lot of conservation efforts to keep them safe. However, it might be too little too late. They did get like prosecuted for being a scary looking shark. A lot of people misidentified this animal as a culprit of shark attacks because they do look so scary and they are quite a large shark. However, they are incredibly docile and are very, very safe to dive with. I've dived with them. They're super cute. They're one of my favorite sharks. And their main defense mechanism is actually like slapping their tail in the water to make a sound that's meant to scare off anything. So they are like, they're not even like munchy in defense. They're just like slappy with their tail, which I think is kind of cute. They're also a very popular aquarium shark because they are so docile and they seem to travel well. So I think despite being critically endangered, I do think they have quite a good chance of surviving through aquariums and potential captive breeding of these sharks. So I'll give them a C tier, just below bull shark, just above reefies. Remember the reefies, whilst they are kind of popular now, if they are ever targeted by the shark finning industry at all, or if there's ever a chance of them not being protected in any area, they can very quickly disappear. The blue shark. I don't know much about them. They are quite a widely distributed shark, pretty much along the tropical and subtropical regions of the world. I assume that they would be at risk of fishing, but they are also a pelagic shark. So I'll put them in B tier. Come on, Wobbegong. I want to put it in front of Wobbegong because they are already so widely distributed. This guy. Fear tier. Okay. There is one shark that I'm going to put in the fear tier, and it's this Lovecraftian horror. This is the shark that I am the most afraid of, and probably like irrationally so too. It's the cookie cutter shark. It's probably only about this big, but they bite holes out of bigger animals. And I'm a bigger animal. So sometimes when I'm diving with whales or dolphins, I might see a hole cut out of them. I'm like, no, don't take a hole out of me. So I'm a bit scared of them. I don't think they're in any risk really, because they are a bit more of like a smaller, inconspicuous shark. It's not interested in bait or fish. It might get caught up in bycatch. Oh, and another fact is, I think in the early days of submarines, these cookie cutter sharks were like biting into submarines, trying to take holes out of them. They are terrifying. I am like not dealing with a cookie cutter shark. I hope I never see one in my life, and if I do, I hope it does not bite me. Okay, then we have a silvertip shark. Now silvertip sharks, again, one of my favorite sharks. What a surprise. These are one of the sharks that I've dived with the most, and they are one of the most intelligent sharks that I've seen in my life. They're very switched on predators. I would like to tell you guys a story of how there was this very intelligent diver that decided that it would be a good idea to sit on top of the bait box, because of course all the sharks are coming right up to it, all the best shots. However, you're associating yourself with food at that point, and that is putting yourself in a more of a risky situation to have a negative shark-human encounter. And then he did something even riskier. He turned his back to all the sharks, and that's a no-no. You never turn your back on any predator, because it A, leaves you vulnerable, and B, it sort of triggers something in a lot of predators. And in this case, a very switched on silvertip did just like change her course and swim pretty much right towards this diver. Not in an aggressive, not an attack way, but more like a, could I? Can I? And sort of seeing what it can do. Seeing what this person's going to do, and if an opportunity arises, it's going to be right on top of it. So I decided I'm going to like pull this interaction apart, and I got in between the shark and the diver. So I just went up, swam to the shark like, no, this is not happening. And then the shark was like, okay, cool, and just swam off. So very intelligent. I have heard stories where the sharks will sometimes work together to lure a photographer away from the rest of the group to see if they can. So they'll start with like one shark will be swimming, and a photographer will follow it, then swim too far away. And another shark will come in and pull the photographer further away from the main group, isolating this person, which is a very predatory response. So very interesting behavior. I've also heard that the younger ones, and I have seen this as well, the younger ones are definitely more boisterous, and they'll be definitely a lot more confident than the bigger ones. So the younger ones are often the ones that the older ones watch. So they'll chase rays up the side of a reef, and if they get a hold of the reef, then the big ones come in. But if the young ones are just inexperienced or they don't know what they're doing, then the older ones will just kind of watch. But they'll watch the younger ones and then take opportunity, and then a frenzy can start from that. So you have to watch the small ones too with the silvertips, and I quite like them because of that. They're very, very smart. In terms of survivability, they are very adaptable. They probably see the same risks as the other reef sharks. So maybe for their intelligence and predatory behavior, I'll put them at the front of C tier, but maybe I'll put them at the end of B tier, because their intelligence, I think, will go a long way with them, and I don't think we know too much about like how intelligent these sharks are. These are just my observations and how I've been impressed with their predatory behavior and how well suited they are to their environment. Then we have here the megamouth shark. We know very little about them. We know that they are fairly widely distributed. However, seeing one is super rare. We know that they're a filter feeder. That's about as much as we know. Probably a good thing for the shark. I'm just going to put them at the end of A tier alongside the other filter feeders. The only real risk towards a megamouth shark is being spotted by people and being caught as bycatch. So maybe I'll even put them here. Put them at the end of S tier, beginning of A tier, with the filter feeders. In part just because, again, another deep sea shark. You're not going to go wrong with a deep sea shark. Here we've got a tawny nurse shark, another very popular reef shark on the reef. They eat crustaceans, crabs. They'll generally like to reside underneath rocky ledges, but will come out on the reef. And sometimes they do also eat fish, but their mouth is more designed to be a more bottom feeder style shark. I'll put them at the end of, maybe I'll put them near the watergang. They don't have too many more threats than, maybe I'll put it here. So they don't have too much defense against larger predators in the environment like tiger sharks. They probably, I haven't heard of anyone catching a tawny nurse shark with a line recreationally. Probably still at risk of being caught by long lines or as bycatch, but generally I think they're a pretty passive shark, really nice shark to see, so probably not too bad there. Now we have the saw shark. So the saw shark is often confused with the sawfish. Saw sharks are much smaller, they've got much finer noses. Sawfish have got like these big chonkers on the ends of their noses. Very similar predatory behavior though. They'll go up to a fish and try to stun it with their nose. And these guys often live in like muddy estuarine areas. Their predators are probably larger rays, crocodiles. So they're not like high up in the survival area. Little is known about them. There are quite a few research efforts going on at the moment in northern Australia to learn more about these sharks. However, I can see this one sort of slipping through the cracks. So I'm going to put it potentially in D tier. This guy here is, I want to say, the seven gill. Yes. The non-deep sea one. So seven gill sharks, they often reside in cooler waters. They are, I guess, the secondary predator in most areas. So you've often got the great whites at the top. Then you've got these guys that will often take a great white's place when a great white isn't there to keep their numbers down or outcompete them. So in South Africa, for example, a bunch of orcas decided that the taste of shark liver was delicious, knocked out a few sharks, and the smell of a great white, like a dead great white, sends shivers of fear down all the other ones. So all the other sharks will disappear from the area. And this allowed these other sharks to come in opportunistically. So I'll probably put them in B tier. Yeah, I'll put them there. Lots of sharks in B tier. Like, it's got quite a bit of environmental pressure from great whites. They are opportunistic. They still face the same threats as all the other sharks in B tier. So yeah, then we have the great white shark. Now, I'm going to put the great white shark right in S tier because despite their negative reputation, they are the shark that you think of when you think of sharks. I think a lot of money and passion and effort is going to be put into protecting these sharks. They are the top of their game. Their only predators are orcas, and that's relatively intermittent. As I said previously, that they do have this sense that if they do smell a dead great white in the water, they sort of release a chemical when they die. It scares all the other sharks away. So what happened in the Neptune Islands once is a shark got caught up in some line, got tangled up and died, And that really hurt their tourism for a while because no sharks wanted to come into the water where a great white had died, because if you're a great white and something kills you, something is terrifying in the water and you don't want to deal with it. So they are sort of like a flagship species. They are definitely one that people are going to put a lot of effort in to conserve. It's very similar to pandas. Pandas, despite like pretty much evolutionarily wanting to go extinct, will never go extinct because China is never going to let their pandas go extinct. China loves their animals so much that they will keep them alive in captive breeding processes, in programs. In captive breeding programs, for as long as they can, they will at very least keep the pandas alive in captivity because it's such an icon for China. Likewise, the great whites, I'll be very surprised if they go extinct because they are such a flagship species for sharks. A lot of people care about them deeply. A lot of people are going to put a lot of money into conservation for these sharks. So I'll be very surprised if a great white will go extinct because of how, I guess, like, they also have such a negative reputation, but that reputation's now twisting to like a lot of people caring about, I guess, the underdog, especially after Jaws. There are a lot of people that would be pro shark culling, but that perception is changing very quickly. So I don't think they'll ever go extinct. They may get close, but the way I see it, unlikely. Now here's the angel shark, the lesser known brother of the wobbegong. Very similar behavior. They sit at the bottom, they wait for something to come past, and they'll go munch. So they'll face similar threats to the wobbegong. They will be at risk to their environment and habitat going under, their food source going under, but in reality they are quite a safe shark. I don't think we'll see anything too bad happening with them in the near future. Now here's an interesting one that I didn't really know much until I made this tier list. This here is a river shark. So there's a couple of different species of river sharks in the world. There's one called the Ganges river shark, which is obviously in the Ganges River, which is sort of North India. There's also a couple of isolated pockets of river sharks throughout northern Australia as well, which I kind of just learned about recently. So like, kind of cool to know. Their distribution is quite limited. I don't think that they'll really make it in the next 200, 300 years. I keep changing it, 100 to 500 years, whatever, because their populations are quite isolated and everything happens to those populations in those regions of the world, then I think they'll suffer greatly. And especially if their prey species die out. Currently in northern Australia, we do have a massive problem with cane toads. Cane toads are incredibly oppressive. They'll eat anything they can. Anything that eats them will pretty much die, except for like 1 or 2 species that are learning not to eat certain parts of the cane toad, so they'll like eat the livers but avoid the poison ducts, poison glands on their backs. So really cool. Cane toads are also adapting to the Australian environment. In areas where they couldn't really get to before, we're seeing cane toads in now and noticing that they have larger bodies and much longer legs. So they are adapting to the Australian environment and becoming more and more invasive. So if the cane toads affect these river sharks' food sources in Australia, or if they start eating the pups of these river sharks, the river sharks don't have a good chance. So I'm going to put them in D tier, sadly. So here is my tier list of sharks who are likely to survive the next 100 to 500 years, I think is the numbers I'm spitting out now. I think that with conservation efforts and a lot of love and attention, a lot of these sharks can make it through and they won't go extinct. But I think some will slip through the cracks, like the saw shark. I think some are too far gone already, like the oceanic white tip, and some that just have environmental pressures that might be too great to really combat, like the river shark. I think all these other sharks still have a okay chance. Obviously, S tier, I think these guys will be fine. these guys should be fine, these guys it's iffy, and these guys it's real iffy. Let me know if you agree with my tier list. Let me know if you learned any shark facts. And if you have any shark facts that I haven't mentioned before, please let me know in the comments. Thank you for making it to the end of this tier list. And until next time, keep blowing bubbles. Hopefully I'm better for the next video, which is going to be hopefully super hype. And until next time, thank you and bye-bye.